أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد آل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواحنا لتراب مقدم الفداء فقد قال الله في كتابه المجيد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم تسبح له السماوات السبع والأرض ومن فيهن وإن من شيء إلا يسبح بحمده ولكن لا تفقهون تسبيحهم إنه كان حليما غفورا صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد. For the hastening of the reappearance of our Imam, please recite the loudest of salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad ala Muhammad. Tonight is a night it's not easy to talk on. It's not easy to move past one's emotions, one's feelings, and to be able to sort of discuss something. Inshallah, we'll try our best to make use of this opportunity. But let's not lose sight. At the end of the day, we're here and gathered, we're mourning, and our hearts should be heavy. And it should not be a night like any other night. It should not be a gathering like any other gathering. It shouldn't be that we can easily smile. It shouldn't be that we can easily think about things that are light, that are entertaining, that are our hobbies, that's our regular life. Let's let the gravity of the situation, of this night, of the events sink in. Let's not move past it too quickly. Let's not brush it aside. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the tawfiq of taking advantage of this night and all other nights. Barakat as-salatu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. اللهم صل على محمد آل محمد. What we've been talking about is the intellect and the ramifications it has on society in a social structure that's built on the true intellect and the true self, and how it would seem to build that kind of society and what are the barriers that might be preventing us to go on that path. One barrier, almost ironically, is the intellect itself. And it is something that we can see, usually through our, inshallah not within ourselves, but sometimes maybe in the people around us. And then if we look more carefully within ourselves, maybe we'll see shades of it too. We see that if I start to understand things, know things, especially if I'm in an intellectual, so-called intellectual heavy field, where it requires a lot of research, it requires a lot of studies to be able to sort of attain a degree or attain some sort of success within that field, then subconsciously what usually starts happening is that a person starts to think to themselves that whatever my mind tells me, whatever my intellect derives, that is reality. And that stops any future inquiry. It stops progress, it stops revision, it stops reflection. Because the person now sees reality just in the lines of what they've seen. And as I mentioned previously, ironically again, this perhaps happens most often with the people who are in the hard sciences. Ironic, why? Because technically you would think that someone who's examining the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wonders that they are, would become closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But because of how the fields are taught, how the environment that they're in, the idea is almost, inculcated within people that this world is all that matters, that everything is about this material world. And so the very understanding that the intellect has of this world becomes a barrier for the intellect to go beyond it. And that's something very difficult. It's very difficult if we've reached that point to move beyond it, to break that barrier. Because we're not saying that we have to ignore the sciences, or the sciences are wrong or bad or anything like that. But they have to be put in perspective. Everything has to be put in its proper framework. If it's put outside of it, in the wrong place, right, then it starts a delusion, an illusion that clouds our eyes. The verse that I quoted in the beginning says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم تسبح له السماوات السبع والأرض وما فيهن ومن فيهن. Says that, and it glorifies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the seven heavens and the earth and everything that is within it. And emphasizing after, it says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ, there's nothing whatsoever that exists except إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ, right, that is doing the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is doing the glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. The only problem is that we can't perceive it, we can't understand it, we can't grasp that this is what's happening. The intellect has this level of realization. That's what we're striving for. Seeing the world in the sense that everything is doing the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a famous story. Right? A lot of people, when they think of the great scholar Syed, they think of him in terms of fiqh, strictly in his jurisprudence and usul and these things. But in his early years, as being a student in Najaf, he was a close student of Ayatollah Qadi Tabatabai, who was an arif, a great mystic. It's related by Ayatollah Shubairi Zanjani, the story, that and he doesn't even give a source for the story, because he says it's so well known in Najaf. If you ask anybody about this, they'll say yes, this is how Sayyid Khui was. It's not needed to give any source, which is surprising for someone like Ayatollah Shubairi Zanjani. I'll just give just some small details. It's someone who's very, very particular about having a source for everything is being said. But in this particular story, he says, I don't need to say anything because it's so well known. Everyone knows it. I said that Sayyid Khui, at a particular time in this training, he would see a cat jumping from one wall to another. And not only would he, by witnessing that, he would be hearing the cat doing the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he would hear the jump of the cat doing the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now I have no clue what that means. I have absolutely no clue what that means. Right? I'm admitting it. Right? What that means, I have absolutely no clue. But that means there's layers to this world. Right? There's things happening beyond our eyes, what our eyes can perceive. That's what we're aiming for. If we lose sight of that there's deeper meanings, a deeper reality, then we lose sight of what is actually real. Because ourselves, our true self, is part of that deeper reality. And so if we cut off the whole world from that, we also cut off ourselves from it. And what happens when we cut ourselves from it is that I start to think to myself, I'm the one who understands this field. I'm an expert in this field. I have this great intellect. I'm, a researcher. I'm an innovator. I'm a whatever, entrepreneur, whatever it is. And therefore now I have the ability to mandate what is good and what is bad. Everything has to be made sense to me. I need to be explained whether this particular act, why this is being told for me to do by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If He doesn't explain it to me, if He doesn't satisfy me about why I should be doing it, I'm not going to do it. It doesn't tell me why exactly I'm praying 5 times a day, I'm not going to do it. It doesn't tell me why I should wear hijab, I'm not going to do it. That's how we start to think. The whole point of having a master is to submit. It's sufficient for us to know that the ahkam, that the lines, the direction is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has our best interest in heart. We don't need any other reasoning to move forward. I'm not saying that we can't ask about the wisdoms of things. No, we can. But we don't need it to then act. It's not that it has to make sense to me to then be able to do it. It's not about it making sense. It's about it coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and me being the slave of Allah. My understanding is irrelevant to that picture. In fact, you might even be able to claim that part of this test is not knowing the wisdom and still having to submit. So it says, well, I've always heard that Islam it's a religion of the intellect. That sounds like blind following. Blind following is bad. It's against the intellect. That's not blind following. Blind following would be that some random person tells me to do something and I do it without knowing who that is, without knowing having any relevance or relation to that person and why they said it. In this scenario, we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've proven Him to ourselves. We believe in Him. And we know that this thing has come from Him and He's directing us in this direction. We might not know why He's told us to do something, but we know that He has told us to do it. So it's not blind following. It's following under the heading that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from me. Again, our difficulty in reaching that is this arrogance that's been caused within ourselves by this idea that we can make sense of everything. And we have to break that. Realize that no, there's a lot of things that we can't understand. There's a lot of things that are beyond our understanding. Okay? Just look at the Quran. Right? The huruf muqatta'a. Right? Those letters that come in the beginning of a few of the surah. Right? Like, Surah Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim. Right? What does that mean? Don't know. Why is it there in a book of guidance if nobody knows what it means? Well, perhaps that's the point. Perhaps it's the point to show us that there are things beyond our understanding. Things are there, but they're beyond us. It's like the pinnacle of human arrogance to think that us, a minuscule speck in the cosmos, is able to comprehend everything, to be able to see the world from God's eyes. It's not possible. That doesn't curtail our struggle and endeavors. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't push ourselves to know more and more. No. All it means is that I'm always going to submit in front of Allah. No matter where I reach, it doesn't matter. I'm still going to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the connection that we see between this and the societal sort of building of the intellect is that sometimes when we look at pressures and social, societal pressures that occur, peer pressures that are there, we a lot of times just think about it in terms of actions. What happens, what people are doing. I feel this societal pressure to act in one way, and so I'm pushed to do so. Right? I feel embarrassed to pray in front of my friends, so I'm pushed not to pray. I feel embarrassed if I don't have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and so I'm pushed by society to do that. And that is true, right? That societal pressure does exist on that level. But there's a deeper level of societal pressure as well. And that's how to see the world, how to perceive the world. For example, I don't know how it is in Canadian schools, but I'll give an example from my sort of experiences in the United States. So I grew up, again, I think I mentioned before, is that I went through public school, right? And barely, and especially in the younger years, probably no Muslim. Maybe when I was in a high school, maybe there's a couple of Muslims in my school. Right? And so very, very within a public school system, that kind of environment, completely American environment. And I'm also from the deep south, right? So very American. We used to, like every morning, the first thing you would do in class would be that you would stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag. Right? Every single day. Right? You would have this as almost like a religious practice. It wasn't taught to us as a religious thing, that this is something that you should do, it's something that you have to believe in. But it was done from such a young age that it became almost ingrained within people's psyche that this flag and everything that it represents is almost holy in how much you need to respect it. Look at how we treat the concept of democracy. We grow up so much surrounded by the idea of democracy. It's almost become like groundbreaking for someone to question that it might be something good or it might be something bad. Please recite the salawat and move a little bit forward.
Please, we're expecting a big crowd tonight. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, my topic isn't democracy, and I don't want to go into it. Right? But just as a caveat, what I'm talking about when I'm mentioning democracy, I'm talking about in terms of theory, not in practice. Meaning that the theory that legitimacy is derived by the votes and the say of the public. That idea, that philosophy, it's for sure wrong. There's no doubt that it's wrong. Legitimacy isn't by people. How do I have any right over you? Why would my vote have any inherent ability to dictate something for you? Legitimacy is derived solely through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, not going into that, but just giving examples that there are things that because of societal pressure we're almost brainwashed to believe in. And we never even consider from a neutral standpoint. I mean, there's still, again, I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, there's still ramifications and like leftovers from like the Red Scare after the Cold War. People still have this sort of taboo of talking about communism. Right? That's how heavy the impact is. Crossing generations. And that means something for ourselves. It means that if we want to have a society that's built on Tawheed, then that has to be at the forefront of what I think and how I think. Not just what I do. It's not just about those very outward practices. It's about why I'm doing them. It's how I connect them to a framework that's consistent within myself. It's about seeing myself constantly in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When I'm like that, when I see the world like that, I exert a pressure on the people around me to also see the world like that. The pressure works this way too, in a positive way. If we as a group are all seeing the world in that lens, then it encourages more and more people to see it like that as well. It creates a shift within society. This is where we have to look at Islam in that lens. We have to see it in that lens of being something so comprehensive that nothing escapes its purview. Nothing is outside of its bounds. Now, the actions that come from a society that has this kind of perspective will immediately become something polarizing. If you have principles and abide by principles, you'll see immediately that there will be people who come towards you and there will be people who you push away. And so, if you see within your life that you only have friends, you only have people you get along with, and you don't have anybody that you sort of don't like or that you've been feel distaste for their actions at the very least, then something is probably very wrong. Because it means that at some level, you just become a people pleaser, right? You just want to make everyone happy. But that means you can't live principled. As soon as you have principles, then, well, the people who don't abide by that same principle will feel detached. That's a natural thing. Especially if these principles are fundamental to your life. Right? Not tangential, like an unimportant detail. Like, I like spicy food, you like bland food. Fundamental. Meaning, what is all of my life for? What purpose is it aiming at? What goal am I going to? And so if our actions show that we're just always almost like a chameleon, conforming to every sort of environment we find ourselves in, and that's not living a principled life. That's not living an Islamic life. Look at Imam Ali alayhi salam. اللهم صل على محمد. He had the most ardent lovers, and he also had the most severe enemies and haters. Because they saw within him an uncompromising principle. That's a natural reaction. It's not like he went out and made people love him and went out and made people hate him. It's a natural reaction to a principled life. There's a beautiful, series of lectures, I believe, that were transcribed that Syed Mutahari had written on this topic. I encourage everyone to sort of, I think it's definitely in English. I think it's the polarization around the character of Amir al-Mu'mineen or something to that extent. Something beautiful. It talks about this in more detail. But this is the idea that we have to have within ourselves, that our actions should be such. But these actions that we have, in order for them to be like that, have to be guided and informed by those principles. And the principles are formed on a bedrock of a knowing what is real. From that, priorities come. From that, we understand this is more important, this is less important. This is where I need to prioritize, this is what I can do later. Look at our own lives. If you just think about it yourselves. Where is it that we, in our personal lives, right? Don't have to answer, don't have to say it to anyone, but think about it. Where do I prioritize my efforts? Where do I put in the most efforts in my life? Right? And I'm talking about specifically time-wise. I'm saying what is the most important things to me by action. Don't give it on the level of oh yes, Islam is the most important thing. No, not on that level. I'm saying by seeing through one's action. Meaning that if push comes to shove, that's what's going to be done no matter what. For many of us, maybe most of us, it's usually something either to do with school or work. That when push comes to shove, that's what wins out. That wins out over everything. That's prioritized. Why is that? It's because we see it to be more important. So that should immediately tell us there's some inconsistency with the way I'm seeing the world compared to how Islam is telling me to see the world. I'm not saying that the work is unimportant. No, it is. But is it ultimately important? Is it the most important? Of course not. It's not. Where do we spend money? Actually, before we even get to spend money, what do we see as valuable occupations? Right? Where we want our children to be when they grow up. Why has it been such an extreme rarity to find a single parent thinking, it would be great if my child was a teacher? We all recognize that we need teachers to run society. On top of that, as Muslims, we should definitely recognize that we need good Muslim teachers for our society, for our communities, for our children. Well, a logical extension to that would be then, I would want my children to be teachers. If I'm seeing a hole within society that's not being filled, and it's necessary, and it's important, one of the most important things, then obviously I would want my child to be able to fill that hole. But I don't think I could remember anyone, at least my limited experience, ever saying that I want my child to be a teacher. Maybe a teacher would say that. Right? Anybody else? We recognize on the level that it's needed. It's good. We might even praise someone. But our own children? Why? Because we think something else gets a bit more fame, get more acclaim, is much more respected in the eyes of others, at the very least. And so I start to think like that as well. What about spending money? What are we the most willing to spend our money on? It usually boils down to things that are self-serving. Things that are for ourselves, that we enjoy personally. More shoes, more clothes, more this, more that. Maybe if you guys are at that level, another car, another house, a fancy vacation. I'm not saying those are inherently bad. I'm saying priorities. What about these majalis? Everyone recognizes that it's important. Right? Everyone loves it, wants to be here. You guys are here. Obviously, nobody's forcing you to be here. Well, inshallah, nobody's forcing you to be here. But paying for it? Giving money up for it? And there's two ways of saying it. There's sometimes there's like the fundraiser. And like someone saying, give me money, and then you keep on thinking about it, and you're like, yeah, how am I going to justify this on the Day of Judgment? I feel really embarrassed, and so I'm going to pay. And there's another time when you own it. It's yours. When I'm always seeing this majlis as this thing that's run by that center and that I'm just tangentially attached to and just, I'm somewhat attending, then obviously you would never feel this thing of wanting. But when you see it as yours, when you're saying that this is a manifestation of your desire to express your grief for Abu Abdullah Hussein, you don't hesitate. It's immediate. So why don't we? What's stopping us? More difficult decisions. If I have enough money to live in a really well-off part of the city, I have a good house with a backyard and all these things, but I won't be living next to mu'mineen. I won't be living in a place where it'll be easy for me to go to the center, where my children can just walk down next door and there'll be another Muslim that they can go to their house and enjoy the company of the children there. Do I even put those factors into my determination of where I'm going to choose to live? What I'm going to choose to buy as a house? What city I live in? Why is it always that that's like the last thing? I get the job and so I move. I found a great house and so I bought it. But then I realized, well, there's nowhere for my children to go, and so now I have to think, how are they going to get the proper education, Islamic education? How are they going to be brought up? Which Maulana can I invite to sort of fix my kids? It doesn't work like that. If the choices we make don't show that priority and that understanding of what's real, then that's what's also going to be transferred down the generations. We can't expect that magically someone can just give a speech and then just flip that on its head, when everything people are experiencing is telling them the opposite. And so we need to be pushing each other on this. We need to be encouraging each other to go further and further on this path. Because again, as individuals, it's really difficult to make a lot of these decisions, to convince ourselves that it's. But if it's not just me making it, I know that you're doing it too. It's not just me making that difficult decision and moving to that one place. It's you too. You're doing it too. Then it becomes automatically, infinitely easier to make that decision. Because I have that support. But a lot of times, what we see is that we break up and split and have divisions and grudges for things that are so insignificant. Right? Let's not even think about like the greater Muslim Ummah. I mean, even within our own very communities, one center. One day everybody is, all on the same page. The next day it's, a big fight and one thing happens and you're being pulled in two different directions. There's a hadith by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He says, It's narrated that he said, لا يفترق رجلان على الحجران إلا استوجب أحدهما البراءة واللعنة ورب استحق كلاهما. He says that two people never enter into a dispute and fight except that it becomes compulsory upon one of them both the distancing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His curse. And it says sometimes it happens to both of them. He says, and it continues and says, and sometimes the person complains. He's like, the one that was being like, let's say that there was one that was oppressed. The one that was oppressed complained like, why am I being punished? That person did something wrong to me. Imam continues, says that, well, because you didn't go and try to resolve this difference. You didn't go and try to resolve this difference. You didn't even speak to that brother after this thing happened. And so maybe both of you will be cursed. Both the one that did the dhulm and oppression and the madhlum. Why? Because the madhlum also did dhulm. Because they didn't swallow their pride and go and try to resolve that conflict. The Imam continues. He says what the madhlum should say is he should go up to the zalim, the madhlum who is oppressed, should go up to the perceive each other to be on the same direction, heading to that same goal, ultimate goal. Then we never have that motivation to move past these slights that we see. Time is limited. I wanted to mention a few other things. One of the things that we see that causes a lot of the splits within communities boils down to practices and customs, especially in the time of Muhurram. If you're not doing matam in a particular way, if you're not doing, reciting the Masaib in a particular way, then that causes differences. The whole point of commemorating Imam Hussain is to become attached to that caravan and becoming a part of it. Look at the beautiful unity within that caravan, in which there were people who are not Shia, there were people who are not Muslim, and yet they gathered under one banner. We have to stand up for that kind of principle. We don't have many accounts of what Imam Hussein's last will to Imam Zain al-Abidin is. But we do have an account of is Imam Zain al-Abidin's last will to Imam Baqir. Within that, he says that I'm going to give and say in my will to you what my father said to me. And so from that way, we have some glimpse of what Imam Hussain said to him. What is one of those lines? He says, "Isbar ala al-haq wa in kana murra." Says, be patient, be steadfast on the path of the truth, even if it's bitter. That's the spirit of Karbala. That's the spirit of hayhat minna dhilla. We should be examining ourselves from top to bottom and finding that dhilla that's within us and trying to remove it. And sometimes, yes, sometimes that dhilla is in the form of practices and customs that have been passed down and that we're used to. And yes, it takes courage to go against that. And yes, I'm not saying that you go and blast people and sort of start a fight. No, you do it lovingly, you do it calmly, you do it respectfully, you do it wisely, in the right place, the right time. But you still do it. you take that stance. If that's what's needed, you do it. Inshallah, we can spend a few moments remembering the Masa'ib of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Dear brothers and sisters, in this short ziyarah, what we're saying is that as long as we remain, as long as the night and the day remain, let this not be the last time that we send our salams. So let's say our salams again. Assalamu ala al-Husayn wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn wa ala awlad al-Husayn wa ala ashab al-Husayn. Dear brothers and sisters, in the caravan of Imam Hussein, there are people of many different ages. There are people from different walks of life who have come and joined. And to some extent, when you look at the martyrs in Karbala, you could picture and envision them on the battlefield fighting. Even if it might be sad to see an old man fighting, even if it might be sad to see a young boy fighting, you could still envision it happening. But there's a shaheed, there's a martyr that can't be seen on the battlefield. There's a shaheed that isn't envisionable and can't be imagined there, has no place there. السلام على الطفل الصغير. السلام على طفل الرضيع. السلام على طفل العطشان. A time comes on the battlefield when a Muslim looks to the left and the right and the هل is there no muwahid who fears Allah among us? He receives no response. It's narrated that he turns to the tents, hearing the wails of the women in response to his calls. He says to Zainab, "Bring me my young son." He takes out his son. It's narrated that he goes towards the battlefield and he tells them, "If you think I've done some sin, punish me. But what has this young infant done to you? At least give him some water." One of the accounts says that he puts Ali ibn Asghar onto the sand and it describes this infant as gasping, as a fish out of water gasps. He receives no response. He picks up this infant, and suddenly he feels something impacting him. He looks down. He looks down to see that Muslim's neck has been pierced from ear to ear with an arrow. fills his hands with blood and throws it to the sky. He says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, هون علي ما أنزل بي أنه بعين الله. The only thing that's made this easy, possible for me to bear, is that you are witnessing this. In some nations after that he's confused. Abdullah doesn't know where to take this body. He goes back and forth, saying, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un, ridan bi qadaihi wa tasliman lahu. What must be going through the heart of Abu Abdullah in this moment? What can he say to the mother of this? That he went for water and got the answer of it. على لعنة الله القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.